Chapter 1. The Storm. 4 young people, 2 girls and 2 boys, were standing in the long grass in the middle of Lichford Green airfield. The airfield wasn't used anymore, and all its buildings were in ruins. Their roofs had fallen, and their walls were broken. Grass and weeds grew in broken places in the concrete runways. The airfield's gates were shut. They hadn't been opened for many years. But the wire fence around the airfield was broken in many places. The kids had walked through one of the broken places. It was raining, and the kids were cold and wet. "This doesn't look very exciting," one of the girls said, "but it will be a good subject for our project." The girl who had spoken was Frankie Fitzgerald. Frankie, a pretty, fair-haired girl, was 13 years old. The other girl was 11-year-old Regan van der Linden. Her hair was dark. The 2 boys, Jack and Tom Christmas, were brothers. Jack was 13 and Tom was 12. Both were fair-haired. "This is a very sad place," Jack Christmas said. "Something terrible happened here once. Perhaps it happened during the Second World War." Jack often said things like this. He often knew things which he couldn't explain. Sometimes he knew what was going to happen before it happened. Sometimes he knew what had happened in the past without being told about it. "Take your photos quickly, Tom," Jack said to his brother. "Then we can all go home. I don't like it here." Tom Christmas looked around carefully. Then he lifted his camera and began to take pictures. Suddenly, the younger girl ran in front of Tom. "Hi! Take a picture of me!" she shouted. "Get out of the way, Regan," Tom replied. "I want to take photos for our project. I don't want pictures of a crazy American kid." Regan's blue eyes were shining. She laughed and pushed her long black hair away from her face. "There's plenty of time for the project," she said. "No, there isn't. We've only got 2 weeks, Tom said. "Today is the 24th of August. We have to finish the project by the 6th of September. And we haven't started it yet." The 4 friends went to the same school. They were all members of the school's archaeology club. Their history teacher, Mrs. Tinker, was in charge of the club. She'd asked all the members of the club to do a project during the summer holiday. They all had to find out about the history of their town of Lichford between the years 1939 and 1945. That was the time of the Second World War. Frankie Fitzgerald had told her 3 friends about the airfield. Lichford Green Airfield, which was at the edge of the town, had been a very important place during the war. Frankie knew about it because she had lived in Lichford all her life. So, Frankie, Jack, Tom and Regan had decided to do a project about the airfield together. "My grandmother was a young girl during the Second World War," Frankie said, as they looked around the wet, ruined airfield. "Gran remembers the Battle of Britain in 1940. Spitfire fighter planes flew from this airfield to fight the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The airfield was a busy place then. It's just a ruin now," Regan said. "We'll see the airfield better from above," Frankie went on. "Darryl is trying to arrange a plane flight for us. He has a friend who flies an old plane." "That will be brilliant," Tom said. "I'll be able to take more photos from the plane." The rain was falling heavily now, and a strong wind was blowing. Suddenly, there was a flash of lightning. The sound of thunder followed it at once. The four friends were in the middle of a terrible storm. "Run!" Tom shouted. "Run back to Darryl's van!" As the kids ran towards the fence, lightning turned everything white again. Then there was a tremendous noise. They were all thrown to the ground. Regan looked up and screamed. A black shape was falling out of the dark clouds. Tom looked up too. "It's a Spitfire!" he shouted. "And it's going to crash!" Another flash of lightning showed the Spitfire more clearly. Flames and smoke were coming from the engine of the falling plane. "No! No!" Regan shouted. At that moment, the plane hit the ground. Chapter 2. The Pilot. Regan jumped up and ran. But she didn't run towards Darryl's van. She ran towards the other side of the airfield. There was only one thought in her mind. The pilot. There was a pilot in that plane. And the plane was on fire. It was burning. They had to get the pilot out. Soon, Regan was near enough to see the plane clearly. The Spitfire had crashed about 200 meters outside the airfield. It had crashed onto a small house. Regan screamed when she saw this, but she ran on. Then she saw a black shape on the grass, about 20 meters in front of her. The shape moved and stood up. It was a man. He was wearing a leather jacket and a leather helmet. It was the pilot. Regan screamed again. The pilot looked at her. Then he ran towards the house. He tried to get into the house, but the flames from the burning plane were too hot. "Help me!" the man shouted. "The children are in there!" Regan saw a flash and heard a terrible roar. Flames jumped high into the sky. The pilot was lifted into the air for a moment. Then he crashed onto the ground. The house was on fire now, but the plane had gone. Regan ran to the pilot. The airman's clothes were burnt and torn. Regan saw his face. It was terribly cut and burnt, but his eyes were open. The pilot was still alive. "We must get Darryl and the van here now," Regan shouted to her friends, who were running towards her. "We must take this man to a hospital." The four friends ran back across the airfield. The storm was almost finished. The sky was getting lighter. Now they could see their friend, Darryl Pepper, sitting in his old van by the airfield gates. "What's wrong?" Darryl asked. "Didn't you hear anything?" Regan asked. "A plane crashed onto a house on the other side of the airfield. The pilot is badly injured. We must take him to a hospital." The kids jumped into the van, and Darryl drove it through a broken place in the fence. Soon they were on the other side of the airfield. "Which way shall I go now, Regan?" Darryl shouted. "I can't see a house anywhere. Where is it?" Regan opened her mouth, but she couldn't speak. There was no house, no plane, no pilot. There was nothing. Darryl stopped the van. Suddenly the sun was shining. A bird began to sing. The four kids and their friend got out of the van. "What exactly did you see?" Darryl asked. "It began with the storm," Jack said. What storm? Said Darryl. There wasn't a storm. What about the thunder? What about the lightning? What about the rain? Jack replied. There was a little rain, Darryl said, but there was no thunder or lightning. And what about the plane crash? Regan said. We all saw it and heard it. Were we all dreaming? Did we all have the same dream? The plane was a Spitfire, Tom said. He knew a lot about old planes. And it crashed near here, onto a house, just outside the fence, Regan went on. The pilot had got out of the plane, but he ran back towards the house. He spoke to me. He said something about children. He spoke with an American accent. While Regan and Tom had been talking to Darryl, Jack had walked through a broken place in the fence. Suddenly, he shouted to the others. Come over here, he said. Look at this. There was a house here once, a long time ago. You can see the shape of its walls on the ground. It's a ruin now, and it's covered with grass and weeds. But there's terrible sadness here. Something terrible did happen here once. Regan turned away. I don't want to stay here anymore, she said. Silently, they all got into the van. Darryl drove very carefully back into Litchford. Did we all have the same dream? Jack asked. No, it wasn't a dream, Regan said. We didn't all see the same things. In her mind, the American girl could still see the cuts and burns on the airman's face. Chapter 3. Darryl's Idea. Darryl Pepper lived in a big room at the top of an old house. Darryl was the kid's friend. He was 19 years old, but some of his hair was already grey. He had a long, thin body and long, thin legs. He wore thick glasses. Darryl had been a student at the kids' school. He'd been the first member of the archaeology club. He was very interested in history and science, and he had many books about these subjects. He didn't work in an office or a factory, but he often delivered things for people in his old van. He earned some money that way. Darryl's room was full of old furniture, books, papers, and pieces of machinery. His computer stood on a big desk near a window. The rest of the desk was covered with papers. Regan, Frankie, Jack, and Tom met in Darryl's room on the morning after their visit to the airfield. Well, who can explain what happened yesterday? Jack asked. I have an idea, Darryl said. Some scientists have a theory which could explain it. It's the psychic stain theory. What's that? Tom asked quickly. Well, sometimes a terrible thing happens, and it leaves a mark in time, Darryl replied. The mark never disappears. It's like a stain that never fades. Then the terrible thing is repeated forever and ever. The theory could be correct. Lots of people believe in ghosts. Perhaps ghosts are psychic stains too. So, that crash did happen, but it didn't happen yesterday. Is that what you think, Darryl? Jack asked. Yes, Darryl replied. It happened in the past, and it left a mark in time. Now, it's like a videotape, which is playing again and again. And yesterday, you all saw it. But why hasn't anyone seen the crash before? Frankie asked. I've lived in Litchford all my life. I've never heard anything about it. That's an interesting question, Darryl replied. I want to find out more about that crash, Regan said. When did it happen? Who was the American pilot? I've been asking some of my friends about this, Darryl said. There are a few Spitfires still flying. They fly in air shows and exhibitions. But no Spitfire has crashed in this area since 1945. So your Spitfire probably crashed during the Second World War. Perhaps it was in a battle with a German fighter plane, Tom said. That poor pilot, Regan said. He tried to save some children who were in that house. Were they all killed? Jack remembered his feelings about the house. Yes, they were all killed, he replied sadly. I want to know what happened, Regan said. Where can we find out about this, Darryl? Well, that crash was repeated yesterday for a good reason, Darryl said. Why? What was the reason? Was the date important? Tom asked. Yesterday was the 24th of August. Did the crash happen on the same date, many years ago? Yes, that's exactly what I think, Darryl replied. Then we can make some guesses, Tom said. The first Spitfires flew in 1938. The Second World War began a year later, in 1939. The war ended in 1945. So the crash happened sometime between 1938 and 1945. Then Tom looked puzzled. But Spitfires were British planes, he went on. Why was an American pilot flying the one that we saw? My grandmother might remember something about the crash, Frankie said. I'll ask her about it. I'm going to visit her this afternoon. I've got a better idea, Tom said quickly. Let's ask someone at the Litchford newspaper, the Litchford Gazette. Jack and I will go to the office of the Gazette. We need facts, not just memories. Does the Gazette office keep copies of the old newspapers, Darryl? Yes, Darryl replied. I have a friend who works there. I'll phone him. He'll let you look at the papers. And I'll go with Frankie to see her gran, Regan said. I prefer old people to old newspapers. That's fine, Darryl said. Then you'll have the facts and the memories. Brilliant, all the children said together. Let's meet tomorrow at my house, Regan said. Will 4 o'clock be okay? Chapter 4. Facts and Memories. Hello, Frankie dear. What a nice surprise, old Mrs. Fitzgerald said. And you've brought Regan with you. Sit down, both of you. We'll all have some tea. In a few minutes, they were all drinking tea and eating biscuits. Frankie began to speak about the project. We went to the old airfield yesterday, Gran, she said. We're doing a project about the Second World War for our archaeology club. We're trying to find out about the fighter planes that flew from Litchford Green. We're trying to find out about the pilots, too. What do you remember about the war, Gran? I remember lots of things, the old lady replied. The airfield was very busy then. There were lots of planes there. The pilots were all tall and good-looking. They came into my mother's shop sometimes. Do you remember a plane crashing near the airfield? Frankie asked. Oh, yes, the old lady replied. The pilot died, and so did some evacuees. My mother told me about it. It was very sad. What were evacuees? Regan asked. During the war, the Germans often bombed our cities, Mrs. Fitzgerald said. So lots of children from the cities were sent to live in the countryside. They were called evacuees. Their parents wanted them to be safe from the bombs. London was bombed almost every day. Lots of children from London were sent to this area. The 4 children who were killed came from London. They were sent to Lichford to be safe. Regan and Frankie looked at each other. So it was all true. The plane had crashed onto the house by the airfield. 5 people had died, nearly 60 years ago. But the 4 friends had seen it happen yesterday. "Why did the crash happen, Gran?" Frankie asked. "I don't know," Mrs. Fitzgerald replied. "I was only 5 years old in 1940. But Florrie Skinner will remember. She's much older than me. But she remembers everything from those days. Florrie was a WAF during the war." "A what?" Regan asked, with a laugh. "She was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force," the old lady said. "The members of that were called WAFs. WAFs didn't fly the planes, but they did important work. Florrie worked in the operations room on the airfield. That was the place where the movements of all the planes were organised." "Where does she live, Gran? Can we talk to her?" Frankie asked. "She lives in an old people's home," Mrs. Fitzgerald replied. "She lives there with lots of other old people. She's not strong now, and the nurses at the home look after her. But she enjoys having visitors. I'll take you to see her tomorrow morning. We can't go now. It's after 2 o'clock, and Florrie always sleeps in the afternoons." Half an hour later, Frankie, Regan, Jack and Tom were in the van der Linden's sitting room. Regan had given each of her friends a can of cola and a bag of potato crisps. Regan's parents were very rich. They owned a big house in Lichford. But most of the time, Mr. van der Linden worked in other countries. This summer, he was working in Rome, and his wife was there with him. Regan was living in the big house in Lichford with an 18-year-old blonde girl from California. The girl was the van der Linden's au pair. She was called Jenny St. Clair. Her job was to look after Regan. But Jenny wasn't clever, and she didn't work hard. She made a lot of expensive phone calls to her boyfriend in the USA. But she didn't care about Regan. So Regan looked after herself, and she had a great time. But Regan didn't like Jenny. When she talked to her friends about the au pair, she called her by a rude name. The blonde bimbo. When they had finished their crisps, the girls told the boys about Frankie's gran and about Florrie Skinner. "We're going to visit Florrie tomorrow," Regan said. "What did you find out at the newspaper office?" "Well, the crash happened on the 24th of August, 1940, Jack said. "And your gran was right. The Spitfire crashed onto a little house near the airfield. 4 young evacuees from London were killed. The pilot died too," Tom told the girls. "And he wasn't an American. He was a Canadian. His name was Glenn Loosthawk." "Why was he in England in 1940? Regan asked. "He was studying at a university here when the war started," Jack said. "Glenn joined the Royal Air Force. He was only 20 years old when his plane crashed." "He was very unlucky," Tom went on. "He'd been in a battle with some German planes. His radio wasn't working, and suddenly there was a terrible storm. He crashed onto the house. A lot of fuel was stored there. The fuel exploded, and everyone was killed." "The crash wasn't the pilot's fault," Regan said quickly. Well, Glenn LetsTalk made a mistake. That's what the newspaper said, Tom replied. It was only Glenn's third flight in a Spitfire. It wasn't Glenn's fault, Regan said again. And he tried to save those evacuees. I saw him running towards the house. The newspaper didn't say that, Tom said. No, it didn't, Regan said. We're the only people who saw the crash. And we only saw it 2 days ago. Those evacuees were the same ages as us, Jack said. They were 13, 12, and 11. There were 2 boys and 2 girls. The boys were brothers, like Tom and me. That's terrible, Frankie said. They left their parents in London. They came to Lichford to be safe, but they were killed here. Poor kids. And poor Glenn, Regan said. No one else will ever know the truth about him now. He was a good man. Perhaps Florrie Skinner knew him. We'll ask her tomorrow. We've still got a lot to do, Tom said. Darryl is trying to borrow a metal detector for us. If we search the airfield with that, we'll find all kinds of things. There must be pieces of planes in the ground. Anything that we find can be part of our project. Perhaps Darryl will arrange that flight for us too, Frankie said. Yes, that will be great, Jack replied. Tom and I will put all our notes onto our computer tomorrow. You 2 girls can talk to the old lady at the old people's home. Chapter 5. What do you want me to do? Regan was asleep in her bed. She was dreaming. In her dream, she heard the roaring engines of planes and the thud of exploding bombs. The ground was shaking. She smelt smoke, and she saw flames. She heard screams and the sounds of people running. Stop! Stop! Come back! Don't leave me! She shouted. Then a dark shape was standing in front of the flames. It was a man. It was the dead pilot, Glenn LetsTalk. In her dream, Regan looked at his terrible burnt face, and she screamed. Suddenly, she was awake, but the ground was still shaking. Regan got out of bed. She walked towards the window and pulled back the curtains. There was a red glow in the dark sky. The glow was over Lichford Green Airfield. Regan turned away from the window. She got dressed quickly and went downstairs. 10 minutes later, she was on her bike, cycling to the airfield. The night was fine and clear. The American girl reached the airfield and left her bike by the gates. She found a broken place in the fence and walked through it. Almost immediately, heavy rain started to fall. Then, Regan heard a voice. "Help me! For God's sake, help me! The children! The children!" The voice was coming to her from across the airfield. Regan closed her eyes for half a minute. Then she opened them again. Nothing had changed. "I'm not asleep," she said to herself. "The children!" the voice shouted again. Regan started to run across the airfield. After a moment, she saw the burning house. "I can't help you! It's too late!" she shouted. Lightning flashed. Thunder roared. The heavy rain fell on her face, but she went on running towards the flames. Then, the pilot was standing in front of her. There was blood on his face. His clothes were burnt and torn. "What do you want me to do?" Regan shouted. The man took a step towards her. Regan screamed. Then she turned and ran back towards the gates. But suddenly, the pilot was standing in front of her again. Regan tried to turn, but she slipped and fell to the ground. A hand touched her shoulder. Regan looked up. "What do you want me to do?" she said again. This time, she spoke quietly. The man pointed towards the burning house. "I can't do anything," she said. "It's too late. It happened nearly 60 years ago." Regan stood up and started walking. Soon she was near the fence. As she walked through the broken place in the fence, the rain stopped. The night was fine and clear again, but Regan was wet and very cold. She got on her bike and rode slowly home. She was shaking with cold and fear. "I must tell the others about this," she said to herself. "But they must finish the project without me." "So, that's why I'm not going to the airfield again," Regan said. "I had to see you and tell you." It was the next morning. The four friends were in Jack and Tom's house. Jack, Tom, and Frankie had heard Regan's story. "The pilot was trying to tell you something," Tom said. "Why did you run away from him?" "I was terrified," Regan replied. "I was very, very frightened. I'm not going back to the airfield." "Okay," Tom said with a smile. "If you're afraid, you don't have to help us." "I want to help you," Regan replied angrily. Then she was silent for a few moments. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet. "I will go back to the airfield, if you all come with me," she said. "Okay," said Tom. Then the phone rang, and Jack answered it. When he put the phone down, he smiled at the others. "That was Darryl," he said. "He's arranged our flight. His friend will take us up in the old plane tomorrow." "Brilliant," Tom said. "Darryl told me something else," his brother went on. "There's a private museum at the Litchford Country Club. It tells the story of Litchford Green Airfield during the Second World War. Darryl has arranged for us to go there. We can go now." "You two go there," Regan said. "Frankie and I will talk to Florrie Skinner. We'll all meet at my house later." Chapter 6. The Museum. Jack and Tom were standing in the little museum at the Litchford Country Club. Outside, members of the club were playing tennis and swimming in the pool. An old gentleman with a big white moustache was smiling at the boys. "My name is George Ballard," he said. "I worked at the airfield during the war. I was a flight sergeant in the Royal Air Force. Please, look around the museum. Ask me questions if you want to." "Thanks," Tom said. "Look at these pictures, Jack." He pointed to some photos which were hanging on a wall. "This is a Spitfire fighter plane, and this one is a Lancaster bomber." "You're quite right," George Ballard said. "Now, look at this." The old man was happy to talk to the boys. He wanted to show them everything in the museum. Jack wrote notes, and Tom asked a lot of questions. At the far end of the room, George Ballard stopped in front of a big photo of the airfield. The photo had been taken from the air. "This picture was given to us by some friends in Germany," George Ballard said. "It was taken by a German airman in a Dornier bomber, just after the Luftwaffe attacked the airfield on the 28th of August 1940. Look, you can see the 3 runways very clearly." "What are all those white marks?" Tom asked. "Those are bomb craters. The big holes made by the German bombs," George Ballard replied. The operations room, we called it the ops room, was hit by a big bomb too. A lot of people died on the 28th of August. The station commander died too. His name was Squadron Leader Alfred Leabridge Smith. This is a photograph of him." George Ballard pointed to a smaller picture. It showed a middle-aged man wearing RAF uniform. "So the squadron leader was in charge of the airfield when the Spitfire crashed onto the house by the fence," Tom said. George Ballard looked very surprised. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "We found out about it for our school project," Jack said quickly. "It was sad," George Ballard said. "The pilot made a mistake. He was a young man, and he'd only flown a Spitfire a few times, and the weather was terrible too. He was unlucky." Jack moved on. He looked down into a cabinet with a glass top. Inside it, there were more photos, an old watch, a leather flying helmet, and then an empty space. In the space was a small card with the words, "Notebook borrowed by Mr. Terry Bowles." Jack put his hand on the glass. It was very, very cold. Suddenly he knew something. The notebook that had been in the cabinet was very important. "What was here, Mr. Ballard?" he asked. "Squadron Leader Leabridge Smith's diary," George Ballard replied. "The squadron leader's grandson, Mr. Terry Bowles, has borrowed it. He's a businessman. He's a very clever man, too. The diary was written in a secret code, and Terry Bowles has discovered the secret of the code. He's going to write a book about his grandfather. The diary will help him with that, but he hasn't told anyone what's in the diary yet." Regan and Frankie were at the old people's home, talking to Florrie Skinner. The old lady was blind. She could no longer see anything. But her mind was clear. She was very happy to talk to the girls. She remembered many things about the war. She remembered the Luftwaffe's attack on the airfield on the 28th of August, 1940. "I was working in the ops room when the bomb hit it," Florrie said. "I was lucky, but some of my friends were killed. That was a terrible day. I had bad dreams about it for years afterwards." "You must have some very sad memories," Regan said. The old lady smiled. "Yes, but they aren't all sad," she replied. "I had a lovely boyfriend. He was a Canadian, and he was very good-looking. I'll never forget him." "A Canadian?" Regan said. "What was his name?" "Was his name Glenn Loosthawk?" Frankie asked quietly. Florrie Skinner smiled again. "Glenn," she said. "Yes, that's right. Glenn. I've got a photo of him. Would you like to see it?" "Oh, yes, please," the two girls said together. The old lady walked slowly across the room. She sat down on her bed. Her fingers found an old red box on the small table beside it. She opened the box and took out a big envelope. "Here are my photos," she said. "Come here and sit on the bed. Find the picture of Glenn." Frankie opened the envelope and looked through the old photos. The first one showed Florrie as a little girl. Then there was one which showed her as a pretty young woman in WAF uniform. And next, there was a photo of a young airman. He was tall and very good-looking. Frankie turned the picture over. On the back were the words, Glen, the 21st of July, 1940. Regan took the photograph and looked at it. The American girl's eyes were full of tears. "Have you found the picture of Glen?" Florrie Skinner asked. "Yes, we found it," Regan said quietly. "That was the last picture that I took of him," Florrie said. "He was killed soon afterwards, and 4 children died the same day. They were evacuees. They were lovely children. Glen and I had become good friends with them. They died on the same day as Glen, but I saw them in the ops room 4 days later. That was the day of the German attack." "You saw the evacuees after they were dead?" Frankie said. "Yes. They were wearing strange clothes, but I knew them," Florrie replied. "They looked like living children, but they were ghosts. Poor little ghosts." Chapter 7. The Phantom Airman. The 4 friends met again in the afternoon. They had a lot to talk about.
"That diary sounds interesting,"
Frankie said.
"I'd like to see it."
"We could phone Mr. Bowles," Jack said. Regan had been very quiet. She suddenly stood up and began to speak.
"I've got to go to the airfield," she said. "I've got to find out what Glen wants."
"When will you go?" Jack asked.
"Not at night,"
she replied.
"I'm too scared to go at night.
I'm going now."
"Then we'll all go with you,"
Frankie said.
"Well, thanks,"
Regan said.
"But please remember this. Glen's face is frightening. You haven't seen it. I have."
"Don't worry," Jack said. "We'll all do this together."
"Come on,"
Frankie said.
"We'll all go on our bikes."
But when they got to the airfield, everything there had changed. They got off their bikes by the old airfield gates.
"What's happening?"
Tom asked. There was a big sign on the gates. "Facelift Construction is building Litchford Green Industrial Estate here. We're building a new future for Litchford. Private. Keep out." Some of the fence had gone. There were trucks and a big bulldozer standing by the ruins of the control tower. There were some mechanical diggers and a big roll of new fence wire. But there were no workmen anywhere.
"What about our archaeology project?"
Frankie said.
"We won't be able to get onto the airfield when these people start work." "And what about Glen?"
Regan asked.
"I've got to speak to him again. I'm going to do it now."
Regan started to walk across the airfield.
"Come on,"
she called to the others.
"This is our last chance."
Frankie, Jack, and Tom followed her.
"That little hill on the right is where the ops room was,"
Tom said.
"We found out about it at the museum. The RAF built the ops room and some offices under the ground. Then they covered the roof with earth. They tried to make it safe, but the bomb hit it on the 28th of August 1940, and several people were killed. We can't get in now. The entrance was covered with earth years ago."
Regan went on walking for a moment. Then she stopped and shouted into the air.
"Glen! I'm here! I want to help you!"
There was silence. The 4 friends waited. Suddenly, a shape appeared in front of them.
"Look,"
Regan whispered.
"It's Glen."
Regan began to run towards the ghost. Glen was wearing his leather jacket and helmet, but this time his leather helmet covered his face.
He's done that to help me, Regan said to herself. He doesn't want to frighten me.
The Phantom Airman pointed across the airfield.
Yes, that's where it happened,
Regan said.
What do you want me to do?
The ghost began to fade away.
Glenn! Don't disappear!
Regan shouted.
Please don't go, Glenn! What do you want? You must tell me!
But the Phantom Airman had gone.
He wants you to look over there, Jack said. He was pointing to the ruins of the old house.
Regan walked on towards the ruins, looking down at the grass. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and she turned quickly. But there was no one there.
Glenn?
She said quietly. Regan pushed at the earth with her foot. She could see a piece of metal in the ground. She bent down and pulled a piece of twisted metal from the earth. The metal was very, very cold.
Did you want me to find this, Glenn?
She asked.
Hey! You! Over there!
A man's voice shouted. Regan turned quickly. A fat man was walking towards her. He wasn't a ghost. Jack, Frankie and Tom walked over to Regan. The four friends stood close together.
What are you doing here?
The fat man shouted.
This land is private.
The man was about 40. He had a round, red face, and he looked very angry.
Can't you children read the sign?
The fat man shouted.
What do they teach you at school these days?
They teach us to find out about things. They teach us to think,
Regan said with a smile.
We are working on an important archaeology project about the Second World War. We haven't finished studying this airfield yet.
Oh, yes, you have,
the man said angrily.
This land belongs to Facelift Construction now.
The man took a mobile phone out of his pocket.
Are you going to leave, or shall I call the police?
He asked. Regan opened her mouth, but Jack spoke quickly.
Please, don't do that, he said. We're leaving now.
The four friends walked slowly back to their bikes. The man stood and watched them.